This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A grain market update with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien starts today's show. He talks about the current market as well as USDA pre-report trade estimates. Continuing the show is Susan Metzger, Brownie Wilson, and Earl Lewis to discuss water in Kansas. They talk about the current state of the High Plains Aquifer and what people should think about for its future. Chip Redmond, K-State meteorologist, completes today's show with a weather update. He says that people can be expecting to experience below average temperatures within the week. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update. And as always, we're joined by K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Dan, starting our grain market update with what are futures looking like?
Well, futures are in a bit of a holding pattern. Just here later today, there'll be a new set of numbers coming out from the USDA WASDE report. That'll have, of course, supply-demand numbers. That'll be based on both a stocks report that's coming out as well as a quote pretty much final U.S. crop production numbers for 2023. So there's a lot of opportunity for change. And on the wheat side, there'll also be a wheat and canola seedings report that'll come out. And of course, markets watching internationally what happens in South America. So when you ask what's going on in the markets, they're waiting. I think they're waiting for more information, and been really pretty flat and low here for about the last week or so. Corn closed yesterday in the March lead contract at 457.5, almost down to 450. And again, we have been down to just about 450 within the last week or so. So again, a lot depending on what happens later today with USDA numbers. On the soybean market, March closed at 1236.5, and for soybeans, we've fallen off sharply in the last week or so. We had been holding at about $13 even up until about a week and a half ago, and then now dropped to closed yesterday 1236.5. So again, waiting for information, for some confirmation what's going on. And for wheat, actually wheat had fallen all the way down to $6 for the March contract, closed yesterday at $6.16. Again, all sorts of issues at hand. I would say for a couple of these commodities that we just talked about, especially wheat, we've had some pretty strong export business within the last week for hard red winter wheat, for hard red spring wheat. So that probably provides some support. And when you see large step up buying like that, again, for those two wheat commodities, wheat classes for the week ending January the 4th, you wonder if we're getting down to the place where we're attracting new buying interest. Apparently we are, even with some of the currency issues we have that are, quote, headwinds in those markets. And I would say we had another one of these periodic large slug of shipments for grain sorghum also happen. Again, when you see that going on, it's largely China coming in for some alcohol beverage industry production, things going on there. So all that for the good. And even corn came in with about a 40 million bushel week, needs about 47 to meet the USDA's projection, but still not bad. And soybeans, 32 million bushels, need a pace for the rest of the year about 26. You're getting to the place where until South America actually harvests their crop, we could be standing decently. But again, a lot waiting, and we'll talk about later in our broadcast what's going on in the what we might expect out of South America and elsewhere for these crop sizes. As we look at the markets also here in Kansas, really not a lot of change, about the same basis levels that you and I have been looking at for several weeks. Still in the corn market, strongest cash price, $4.78 in Garden City, strongest cash bid, and that's 20 over, cash bid of 10 over for new crop corn in Garden City at $5. And most of the rest of the parts of the state have, for corn price bids, about 5 to 10 under, in Colby, Salina, Topeka. Hutchinson has a 4 over bid, 19 under in Columbus. So again, just kind of biding time, not a lot going on yet. In these areas with low corn prices, as we're seeing now, I would wonder about the eventuality of users, livestock feeders, ethanol plants, you name it, coming in and wanting to bid grain, needing to bid up grain, and probably with better basis bids locally to pull it out of farmers' hands. They're probably not that anxious to sell at low prices as they view them compared to where they've been. So we're about to enter into for the rest of January, February, and probably into March, this delicate balance of how much users can afford to pay and how much sellers are willing to what do they want in terms of bids to look at things better. Still stronger grain sorghum bids. We talked about some of the export markets looking decently. We have really positive bids in places like about 39 over in Salina over the March contract, 24 over in Topeka, about 34 over in Hutchinson. So again, it's pretty strong basis levels, I think, indicative of some of this export movement we've been seeing. Soybeans, one really strong new crop bid cash bid for soybeans in the Hutchinson area at 12.31 to 5 cent under basis. Most everything else in Salina, Topeka, 35 to 50 under, 47 under in Columbus, wider than that, closer to $1 or more in Colby and Garden City. And wheat bids are all pretty much now just breaking below $6. Strongest bids, 5.96 in Salina, Hutchinson, 5.91 in Topeka, 5.36 in Colby, and then you see 5.60, 5.65 in Garden City, Columbus. So again, I think in fairness, when you ask, well, what are the markets looking like? They're waiting. They're lower than most ag producers would want to have. They're reflecting probably at this time what ag users can pay, given their markets, the markets that they have or are willing to pay. And I guess we'll see what new information coming into the market from this USDA report, from weather in South America as we keep going forward for the rest of January and February and such, and other export demand. How all that works out to lead us to ending stocks to use numbers for these major crops in the U.S. to give us more guidance on where prices might go.
And you've mentioned that USDA report that's coming out today on the 12th a few times, and there are a few pre-report trade estimates that you'd like to share with our listeners.
Yes, hotly contested. When you talk to ag groups, they have opinions one way or the other about this. The average trade estimate for U.S. corn production to come out of this report here at 11 is just about identical, just slightly below what the USDA had said in its November-December report, about 15.226. So here we're down to cutting hundreds of thousands of bushels. In essence, the same, just slightly lower from the USDA numbers. And the soybean pre-report trade estimates for production just slightly higher. So really, any change up or down in U.S. yield or production will actually be a surprise to the market and could bring some pretty volatile moves. So we'll be watching that, and following right on the heels of those production estimates, you'll have the WASDE supply demand balance sheets and estimates of ending stocks to use. And right now, for the corn market, traders are estimating about a small, about 25-30 million bushel reduction. So that could, if that comes about, that could be on the positive side. Essentially unchanged for soybeans, and for wheat essentially unchanged. So again, you go into a situation like this with expectations of no change. So if change happens, then it brings things about. It brings potential volatility to the market. And really the most hotly contested numbers would be the South American crop production issue. USDA projected Brazilian corn at 129 million metric tons. Pre-report trade guesses about 125. There are independent in-country estimates that are lower than that. Similar, if not even more pronounced, for soybeans. The USDA in December report had 161 million metric metric tons of production projected, and 156 is what the trade thinks the USDA will probably say here in a little bit. In-country reports the last couple of days coming in below even what the market thinks the USDA will say. So you can just imagine here this week we're talking to a soybean group, and this issue of what this report will say is a major topic of discussion, because again they just like any of these commodities with the predominance of ag producers in it, they would hope for the best selling prices that they could for their profitability, and where corn, soybeans, grain, sorghum, even wheat prices will go in the next several months, quite dependent on what these reports will show. And there are other things out there. I just mentioned them quickly, Shelby. There are estimates of, like we'd mentioned before, there'll be a wheat seeding estimate. And looking at those numbers prior to this report, you've got some estimate that will be sideways to lower for acreage. And really, what the seeded acreage for winter wheat's already happened, and the snow that's coming in those areas is a great blessing in terms of potential moisture to get that crop going in the spring. We shall see. I guess once we get into spring, get these crops planted, then it'll be up to the climatologists to give us some idea of what the moisture prospects are and crop prospects are for 2024, and from there we'll figure out prices.
Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our grain market update, and a look forward to some pre-report estimates for the USDA WASDE report.
Thank you, Shelby. Take care.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. I will link his information from AgManager.info in today's show notes on agtoday.net, as well as that upcoming WASDE report. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Friday show discussing water in Kansas. And in to talk about it, we're joined by Director of K-Care in the Water Institute, Susan Metzger, Water Data Manager for the Kansas Geological Survey, Brownie Wilson, and Chief Engineer of Kansas Department of Agriculture Water Resources, Earl Lewis. Susan, Earl, Brownie, I appreciate you all taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby. Really appreciate the opportunity to be on.
My pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. And kicking off this conversation, talking about what concerns we're seeing with water in Kansas, Susan.
For those listeners that might not be familiar with the Ogallala High Plains in western Kansas, so the Ogallala Aquifer is the largest freshwater aquifer in the world. It underlies 8 states, including Kansas. So most of the water supply for western Kansas relies on the Ogallala High Plains Aquifer, but it is a finite resource. While it receives some recharge on an annual basis, we use the water faster than it can be recharged. So that's really kind of the key of why we're having this conversation today, because we know that if we look into the future and don't change our actions as soon as 40 years from now, that resource could be 70% depleted, and 40% of the acres that depend on irrigation and sustain our state's largest economic driver, agriculture, would no longer be able to sustain that type of production. So it's really important that we align the science and practice to address that concern. And Earl and Brownie are helping us do that. So Brownie, I know you've just spent some time in western Kansas in this delightful weather measuring wells, and you do that every year. How important is that data, and what are you seeing as far as some trends?
Yeah, we go out, state of Kansas, has a focus on the High Plains Aquifer because it is such an important resource for us. So every January, the Kansas Geological Survey and the Kansas Department of Agriculture Division of Water Resources, we go out en masse and we measure about 1,400 water wells, focused primarily in the High Plains. We do measure a few other aquifer units, but we do that every single year. And the idea here is we try to measure those same wells every time so that we get a long trend, a long baseline, you get an idea what the aquifer is doing. And this year we're still underway. This last snow event was pretty big this week, and so we're going to be a little bit delayed getting into some of the wells. But the majority of them, at least on the survey side, we got measured. And I think we're kind of seeing a little bit of a reset from 2022. 2022 was one of the driest years we had on record in Kansas. And in some places, like Garden City, for example, they got like 7 inches of rainfall in 2022. And that's something you see like in Phoenix. And so what happens is that dry conditions leads to a longer pumping season in our state. And so the water levels really didn't have a chance to recover in 2022. So they were a little bit deeper. I think we're starting to see that kind of average out this year. And so the water levels this year so far in northwest Kansas and west central Kansas have been pretty close to zero, I think, at the end of the day when we start averaging things out. And then as we moved into southwest Kansas, we had a couple of spots where we had a little bit of declines, but not nearly as bad as what we saw last year. And so that's the good news. And so, Kansas is very fortunate. That's a very important data set in terms of our water level data. But another data set that we have that allows us to do lots of wonderful things deals with water usage. And I'm going to kick that over to Earl and let him discuss more about that.
That's exactly right. We are very, very blessed to be data rich when it comes to water, at least compared to a lot of our neighboring states or a lot of the world. The water level measurements that Brownie talked about have been going on fairly consistently at that level since the mid-90s, and that's really pretty rare. The other thing that is rare is that back in the mid-80s, the state of Kansas required that every single water right holder, non-domestic, submit an annual water use report to the Division of Water Resources by March 1st. And in the mid-90s, early to mid-90s, we got to the point of actually installing totalizing flow meters on almost every water right or every well across the state. And that's really rare. Brownie just mentioned Phoenix, and you think of Arizona and the problems that they're facing, and you would think that they would have a really, really good handle on water use and what's going on. And from that perspective, Kansas is far and away ahead of Arizona and a number of western states as far as measuring that water use. Those two pieces of data are critical to making sure we understand what's going on, what's causing the issue, and how we can remedy it. We are right in the middle of water use season. Remind those folks that do have water rights that now is a great time to go out. And if you haven't checked that meter, do it before the next snow hits. Get that water use report filled out and get it in by March 1st so that we don't have a compliance issue, because we certainly need that data and we want to make sure that we get it in a timely manner.
Earl, you mentioned remedy the issue. And so what have you been seeing done, and maybe what could be done in the future?
We always say it's a big issue, but the basics of the issue are pretty simple, right? We're taking out more water than Mother Nature puts back. So, our only options are we find a way to bring more water into the system, or we reduce the use of that water. Bringing more water into the systems is going to be very difficult to do. So we've really got to look at how can we reduce our overall water use. And we've got some folks that have done that and are still being successful farming. We have water conservation areas where an individual farmer or a group of farmers could come together, develop a management plan where maybe they get a little more flexibility in how they use their water. At the same time, they're actually reducing their overall use and draw on the aquifer. We have other areas where it's maybe a larger area, a county or even multiple counties, where a local groundwater management district can recommend what's called a local enhanced management area, or a LEMA. As we give farmers the rules and some flexibility, they can be successful. And one of the places that I think has been really helpful, as well as our data, is we've got great research institutions that are helping us define those problems and find solutions to them. And so I know that K-State, I might kick it back over to Susan, because K-State has had some really good research that has helped some of these farmers stay productive while using less water.
Yeah, it really is putting all those parts and pieces of the puzzle together to, like you said, it sounds like a simple solution. You just use less water, but figuring out the ways that a producer can do that successfully for their bottom line, still maintaining great food production. So K-State Research and Extension, with folks on the ground like Jonathan Aguilar, have been able to help producers make that transition, whether it's a transition in technology. We know that we've seen over the past 30 years just a strong shift from a history of flood irrigation to center pivot irrigation, and that center pivot irrigation now being to really efficient drop nozzles, but then also helping them to think about changes in their water management practices when they apply water, and also their crop selection is really key. And one thing I think is pretty exciting, because, Brownie had talked about going out and doing these well measurements every year. That's really our holistic view of the entire aquifer in Kansas. But the Kansas Geological Survey has a new approach that really allows you to center into a focused area, which is really key when people are thinking about making shifts in their own management management. They want it to impact their own neighborhood and community. So Brownie, could you talk about the Q-stable approach and really how it's been characterized as a game changer?
Well, thank you, Susan. Yeah, and this kind of plays off of our great data sets that we've been talking about with water use and water level change data from our wells that we measure. We've noticed that the aquifer in the Ogallala is remarkably consistent in the way it recovers at the end of the pumping season. And we're able to use our data sets, and this is completely data-driven. There's no conceptualization on what we think the aquifer might be like. The data is telling us what it's like. And we were able to, in many cases and for many areas of the aquifer, identify these relationships that tell us then how far out of whack are we? How much more groundwater usage is taking place than what goes into the system? And then what's our budget look like for our localized areas? And then that kind of gives us a number to at least to shoot for. And that, again, varies depending on where you're located at. But some of our past estimates from, 10, 20, 30 years ago were pretty big numbers in terms of what we needed to reduce to stabilize water levels. And what we're finding is, in a lot of cases, that number is much smaller. But, 10, 20, 30, maybe even a 40% number in terms of reductions to match out what our water level inflows are going to be. And that numbers might be a little bit more palatable than, when we asked this question 30 years ago, we thought it might be 80 or 90%. And so with the adaptation that farmers can make and still be profitable, that's kind of the goal here is to keep everybody viable and feeding the world and making money and stabilizing our water levels of the state at the same time. It's not an easy task, but it's something that is definitely doable, and we're seeing that on the ground in certain places.
If you guys could share one thing with ag producers concerning water right now, what would it be?
I might start with that and simply say this is an opportunity to own your future. What you do for the Kansas economy and for the world is so keenly important, and we're here to help you make those changes.
Chime in by saying, groundwater moves just like it does on the surface, but it moves exceptionally slow. And people that make the effort to conserve water, that water is going to stay there, and they're going to get the benefits of that conservation. It's not just going to flow out from underneath them. And so the effort and the hardships and the investments that go into place, they're going to enjoy those benefits in terms of that water conservation.
And I would say, I think, we think about this, or it may seem like an overwhelming problem, such a big problem that maybe I can't do anything, but I think it is a community problem, and everything that you do as an individual producer contributes to that solution as well. And so you have the opportunity to make a difference for your own property, your own operation, your own community, for yourself and for future generations. So I'd encourage folks to think about the future and be proactive in their activities.
If someone would like to stay up to date with kind of what's happening with water in Kansas, where could they do that?
So I encourage them to do a couple of things. The Kansas Department of Agriculture Division of Water Resources page really has so many great resources. You can also go to K-State's Kansas Water Institute page and keep up with the great things that are happening in the Kansas legislature and the House Water Committee.
That was Director of K-Care and the Kansas Water Institute, Susan Metzger, and Water Data Manager for the Kansas Geological Survey, Brownie Wilson, and Chief Engineer of Kansas Department of Agriculture Water Resources, Earl Lewis. I will link the resources that Susan mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update. And as always, we're joined by K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, recapping some weather we've had this past week, and we had a storm.
We did have a storm. It started out as rain for a lot of folks on Monday morning, and then it transitioned into a much colder portion of the storm as it moved off to the east. It brought some cold air around. We haven't really had a ton of cold air this year, and that brought a pretty potent storm system of the winter variety for most of western and central and really the whole state. The worst conditions, though, were definitely out west, where they saw 50, 60 mile an hour winds for a sustained or extended period of time. And that combined with no one really knows how much snow fell out there. I would say anywhere between 5 and 10 inches of snow in a lot of places resulted in some pretty substantial drifting, and basically every road in the state west of 81 for the most part being shut down. And that was probably one of the more impactful storms we've seen in the last 10 years. We did see snow further east. Thankfully, it wasn't accompanied by that strong of winds, but the strongest winds that we measured in the central and east was around the 40-mile-an-hour mark, and that's enough to blow any snow that we had. And snow totaled anywhere from a couple inches. Kind of the Manhattan-Kansas River corridor was really the lowest in the area, except for the far southeast part of the state where they only got about a half to 1 inch. But we saw totals as much as 12 inches in several places in the Flint Hills and north along the Nebraska border. So a big potent storm system that brought moisture equivalents of an inch plus for a lot of folks in central and eastern Kansas.
With all that moisture, did we see some drought changes?
We did. We saw fairly substantial drought changes. We only have 0.5% of the state now in D3 drought, which is really isolated to the Rooks County area. The rest of the state saw improvement, and that's a big change from a year ago where we had over 60% of the state was in D3 or worse drought. So big changes from a year ago. And as we look at just other areas, we saw some improvements, and mostly in the central part of the state this week with those rains.
As we look forward, what can people be expecting?
So the big story was the snow that we had this morning. We had a couple inches mostly along and north of I-70, and with the highest totals around the Nebraska border with the cold airs here. We had a chunk of the polar vortex broke off, moved southward into the United States. That's going to bring us temperatures through the weekend that are barely going to get above zero during the day. So very cold weather, and we add any wind to that at all. We have another cold front tonight that's going to bump up the winds into Saturday. And then again another one on Sunday, and that'll yield your wind chills down into the negative 20s and potentially 30s, just because it's so cold. It doesn't take much wind to get really low wind chills. But we're at the coldest time of the year. January 11th through the 18th is the coldest time climatologically for the whole state. And so when we average below normal temperatures during the coldest time of the year, it's stinking cold. And we'll be cold through likely Tuesday. See some opportunity for some warm-up on midweek next week. We might get back up to freezing if we're lucky. So winter's here, and we've been lucky with the warmer temperatures. And so I have some concerns about cattle and whatnot. They haven't been acclimated. There's been a lot of snow, a lot of blowing snow. There was still some mud, too, so the ground freezing up will be good for them. But just overall cold is going to be a challenge for everyone, I think.
And as we've talked about snow, are we expecting to continue to see snow at those cold temperatures?
Yeah, typically as it gets cold around here, the air gets a lot drier. We have northwest flow that brings that cold air in. So I don't expect any more impactful systems. Might see a trace of or maybe up to an inch of snow at times, but it's going to blow a lot with the winds. But overall, we're done with this big, impactful storm systems until we warm back up and we can get a more dynamic system in here, possibly by the end of January.
What do you mean by a more dynamic system?
We're talking about a system that has some warm, moist air to work with that sucks out of the Gulf and that provides a very baroclinic or basically strong temperature gradient. And we need those strong temperature gradients to get these big storm systems that produce a lot of moisture and precipitation. When it's cold and we just have winds out of the northwest, we don't typically see that. We see weak systems that are just enough to make it colder, but we don't have moisture to work with.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.